Picture ancient Rome, and the image that comes to mind is almost always a villa, marble floors, a shaded courtyard, a household of citizens living in quiet comfort. That image exists for a reason. It's the version of Roman life that survived best. In the ruins, wealthy families left behind, and the writing wealthy Romans left about themselves. But it describes a small minority. In the city of Rome itself, at its height home to roughly 1 million people, the overwhelming majority didn't live in anything resembling a villa. They lived in rented apartment buildings called insulae, and understanding how those buildings actually operated as a business tells you something about ancient Rome that the marble floors never will. Start with the basic shape of the problem. Rome, unlike a spread-out Roman villa estate, was land-constrained. It sat within walls, on a handful of hills, with a growing population that had nowhere to expand outward without leaving the city entirely. If you owned land in Rome and wanted to make money from it, the answer wasn't to build low and spacious, it was to build up. An insula, literally island, the same word Latin used for a building standing on its own block, was, in its most basic economic definition, a way of stacking as many paying tenants as possible onto a single, expensive piece of urban ground. This is the first correction to the popular image, and it's a significant one. For most Romans, home wasn't a house you owned. It was a rented floor or a rented room in a multi-story building owned by someone else entirely, often someone who never lived there and might never have set foot in the building at all. So what did that building actually look like, and how did it generate income for its owner? A typical insula rose several stories above street level. Surviving examples and written descriptions suggest 4, 5, sometimes more floors were common, and height was, from a landlord's perspective, the entire point. Every additional floor was another set of rentable units on the same footprint of land. The ground floor was usually the most valuable and the most differently used. Shops and workshops facing the street, sometimes a more spacious apartment for a wealthier tenant, all commanding higher rents because ground floor space was easiest to access, easiest to secure, and closest to the street's foot traffic. As you moved up the building, conditions and rents both declined. Upper floors were typically smaller, more cheaply partitioned, and reached by narrow, often poorly built wooden staircases. The very top floors were usually the cheapest and the roughest, small subdivided rooms, sometimes little more than a single space, rented to the poorest tenants in the building. This vertical structure wasn't incidental to how insulae were built, it was the business model. A landlord wasn't selling an apartment building, he was selling dozens of separate, individually priced income streams stacked on top of each other, each one calibrated to what a different tier of tenant could afford, from wealthy shopkeepers on the ground floor down to day laborers packed into garrets under the roof. And this is where the economics start to diverge sharply from the popular image of solid, enduring Roman engineering that most people carry around from aqueducts and amphitheaters. Public infrastructure, the kind built and maintained with state resources for the state's own prestige, represents some of the best construction of the ancient world. Private rental housing, built by landlords optimizing for rentable floor space per unit of construction cost, frequently represents close to the opposite. Roman writers themselves complained about this. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st or early 2nd century, describes the fear of living in an insula in vivid, bitter terms: flimsy walls, structures propped up and patched rather than properly rebuilt, and a constant undercurrent of dread about fire and collapse. This wasn't an isolated complaint. It reflects something structural about how these buildings got built in the first place. Cheap materials, timber framing, rubble and mortar construction, minimal foundations, kept construction costs down and let a landlord recoup his investment faster at the direct cost of the building's long-term durability and its tenants' safety. Here's the overlooked cost that this business model quietly built in. Fire and structural collapse in Roman insulae weren't rare, freak disasters. They were a predictable, recurring feature of how rental housing in Rome actually worked. Open flames for cooking and heating, packed wooden structures, narrow streets that made firefighting difficult, and construction that prioritized speed and height over structural soundness combined into a genuinely dangerous environment for the people living in the upper floors. The same people who, not coincidentally, were paying the least and had the least ability to simply move somewhere safer. And this is where the story turns towards something that most retellings of Roman history skip entirely, because it reframes fire from a pure disaster into, for a certain kind of landlord, a business opportunity. The clearest, best documented example of this is Marcus Licinius Crassus, a name some people recognize from his later military and political career and his famously enormous personal fortune, but whose fortune's real foundation, according to the ancient biographer Plutarch, was Roman real estate. According to Plutarch's account, Crassus assembled and personally maintained a private brigade of enslaved men trained in construction and firefighting, several hundred of them, by Plutarch's telling. When a fire broke out in the city, which happened with real regularity, Crassus's men would arrive at the scene. But according to Plutarch, Crassus wouldn't necessarily order them to start fighting the fire immediately. Instead, while the building, and often neighboring buildings threatened by the spreading flames, burned, Crassus would offer to buy the property from its panicked owner at a price reflecting its current, fire-damaged, worthless-looking state. Only after securing the purchase, in this account, would he set his men to work extinguishing the blaze and salvaging what could be saved. It's worth pausing on how genuinely counterintuitive this is, because it inverts the entire relationship between risk and ownership that the insula as disaster-prone housing framing implies on its own. Fire wasn't simply a cost that fell on landlords and tenants alike. For someone positioned correctly, with capital ready to deploy and, in Crassus's case, literally controlling the firefighting response itself, fire could function as a forced sale mechanism, transferring ownership of valuable urban land from a desperate, uninsured owner to a buyer able to set his own price under duress. Plutarch reports that through this pattern, repeated across the city over years, Crassus came to own a very substantial portion of Rome's real estate, which he then rebuilt, presumably to a higher standard, since it was now his own asset generating his own rental income, and let out at a profit as, once again, multi-story rental insulae, a caution worth stating plainly here. Plutarch was writing roughly a century and a half after Crassus's lifetime, working partly from earlier sources that haven't survived, and ancient biographers were not shy about shaping a life story around a moral theme. In Crassus's case, a life defined by an almost pathological pursuit of wealth. Modern historians generally treat the broad outline of Crassus's real estate-driven fortune as credible, given how consistently it appears across surviving ancient sources, while treating some of the more vivid specific details. The precise negotiating while burning scene, with the appropriate skepticism due to any colourful anecdote in ancient biography. But even taking the account at a cautious, generous level of skepticism, the underlying mechanism it describes, chronic fire risk in densely built rental housing, creating recurring opportunities for a well-capitalized buyer to acquire distressed property cheaply, lines up with everything else we know structurally about how insulae were built and how Roman fires actually behaved. This is the chain reaction worth tracing all the way through, because it explains why the insular system persisted despite its obvious dangers rather than reforming itself on its own. Cheap, fast, profit-maximizing construction increased fire and collapse risk. That elevated risk periodically destroyed buildings and depressed the value of fire-damaged or collapse-prone property. Depressed, distressed property created buying opportunities for landlords with the capital and, in cases like Crassus's, the operational control to move quickly. Those landlords then rebuilt, not necessarily to a meaningfully higher standard, since the same cost pressures that produced the original cheap construction still applied, and rented the reconstructed building out to a new set of tenants, restarting the same cycle. Nothing in this loop, left alone, pushed towards safer construction. If anything, the cycle rewarded exactly the opposite. Buildings that were profitable to lose were, from a purely financial standpoint, not obviously worth making safer, left entirely to this private incentive structure. In other words, there was no strong internal reason for the insular system to improve. Change, when it eventually came from outside the rental market entirely, from the state. Rome experienced a series of catastrophic fires over its history, the most famous being the Great Fire of 64 CE under Nero, which by ancient accounts destroyed or severely damaged a large portion of the city. In the fire's aftermath, Nero implemented a genuinely significant set of building regulations, requirements for wider streets to slow the spread of fire and improve access for firefighting, limits on shared walls between buildings, and encouragement of more fire-resistant materials in place of the cheapest timber construction. Even earlier, under Augustus, height limits had already been imposed on insulae, specifically because uncontrolled vertical building, exactly the profit-maximizing logic described earlier, had been producing structurally unsound, collapse-prone towers. Later, under Trajan, that height limit was tightened further. None of these regulations eliminated the underlying economics of cheap rental construction. They constrained it, imposing a ceiling on how far a landlord could push cost-cutting and height before running into the law, precisely because the market on its own hadn't produced that ceiling. So what did owning an insula actually deliver, in the best case and the far more typical one? In the best case, and Crassus represents something close to the ceiling of this outcome, a landlord with real capital could use fire and collapse not as a threat to be feared, but as a recurring acquisition opportunity, assembling an ever larger portfolio of urban real estate, rebuilding it, and collecting rents from a genuinely enormous tenant base. Crassus's fortune, by the account that's come down to us, was built substantially on exactly this cycle repeated at scale, and it made him, by later report, one of the wealthiest individuals in Roman history. The far more common experience, and this is worth stating clearly, because it's easy to lose the tenant side of the story entirely inside a narrative about clever landlords, was considerably grimmer. For the ordinary Roman renting an upper floor of an insula, the building's economics from the landlord's side translated directly into daily risk on the tenant's side. Cheap construction meant a real, recurring possibility of fire or structural collapse. A lack of individual property ownership meant no equity being built and no long-term security, only a lease that could go unrenewed. And a building optimized for maximum rentable floors per lot meant cramped, often poorly ventilated living space with minimal sanitation, particularly in the upper stories farthest from street-level water and waste infrastructure. The tenant bore essentially all of the building's physical risk, while the landlord captured the upside whenever that risk resolved into an opportunity rather than a personal loss. So bringing bring it back to the image you probably started with, marble floors, a quiet courtyard, a settled Roman household. That image is real, but it describes the exception, not the rule. For most people living in the city of Rome, home was a rented floor in a building built as cheaply as the law would allow, owned by someone who might never live there, in a market where the landlord's biggest financial risk, fire, could, for the right buyer with the right resources, quietly become someone else's biggest opportunity. The Insula wasn't simply Roman housing. It was Rome's original rental real estate market, built on population density, land scarcity, and a cost structure that rewarded height and speed over durability. And in its most extreme documented form, in the career of a man who is said to have gotten rich buying burning buildings, it reveals something that predates almost every modern conversation about landlords, tenants, and who actually bears the risk when a building goes up in flames.